Hello, Canada Files viewers. This is Aidan Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files. I am here with Dimitri Lascaris, lawyer, journalist, and activist. He is either in Kalamata, Greece, or Montreal. So, Dimitri, thanks for being here as always.
Always a pleasure, Aiden. How you doing?
Doing good. Hope you are as well. So, we are now talking about the Canadian Foreign Interference Inquiry Final Report. So the first section of this paranoia has ended with a report that says no traitor MPs. Han Dong, the MP, didn't tell the diplomat from China to keep the two Michaels. The expelled Chinese diplomat Zhao Wei didn't engage in foreign interference towards Michael Chong, the MP, according to the national security community. And this much heralded NSCIOP report declaring traitors in parliament was overdramatic and made a number of errors. So, Dimitri, as a huge fan of the Canadian state's utter obsession with supposed interference in Canadian politics by China, Iran, Russia, India, and others, how do you feel about the key findings of the inquiry?
I have mixed feelings. First of all, I'm happy to have been vindicated because I've been saying for years that this is a scam, and I don't think you could have a more resounding demonstration that this is a scam than this. When you think about the amount of oxygen that was sucked up by these allegations of foreign interference in the Canadian corporate media and in the political discourse, and you compare, this alarmism, this hysteria that we've been witnessing day in, day out, Aiden, for years, compare that to what the judge found, which is that this is a big nothing burger. This had absolutely no impact on the Canadian elections, the last two elections. And there might be some evidence that maybe one or two nomination contests or one or two ridings were affected, but she's not even prepared to say, with high confidence that any nomination contest was affected or any riding was affected. What she does say with high confidence is that this didn't alter the outcome of any election, nor did it result in legislation being passed that would not have been passed, or legislation not being passed that should have been passed. So again, a complete and utter nothing burger, and she even goes so far, two notable but related issues. She goes so far as to say, look, intelligence has limited, utility. And you have to be very careful how you use it. Sometimes it can be downright wrong. And it's particularly important to be cautious when you are using it in a way that can have a negative impact on somebody, which is usually the case. So here, for example, alleging that, some MPs or candidates were effectively traitors. This is tremendously negative impact if these allegations are believed. The other thing she said, she actually, gently chastised the media for getting all worked up, but then she exonerated them, saying, well, based on the limited information they had, it's understandable that they overreacted. So I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what she said. What I say at the same time, I have mixed feelings, Aiden, and that's because even though she came to these conclusions quite properly, she goes out of her way to say that disinformation and misinformation and malinformation are an existential threat to Canadian democracy. Uh, what is she talking about exactly? Who are the biggest purveyors of disinformation in our society? The biggest purveyors of disinformation in our society are the corporate media and the so-called mainstream political parties. So just to give an obvious example of this, for 2 years, 3 years, almost 3 years now, they've been telling us that Ukraine was winning this war and against Russia, and that it would win the war. And now we know that this was a flagrant lie. In fact, Marco Rubio himself, the new Secretary of State of the United States, hardly a friend of Russia, just came out and said that we've been deceiving people for years about Ukraine's ability to defeat Russia. That's what he said. So, did the judge, Justice Hogue, take the media to task for lying to us about the last 3 years about this proxy war, which has now resulted in the destruction of Ukraine, a supposed ally of the West? Not a word. Not a word about it. What about disinformation regarding Israel's genocide in Gaza? I checked all 7 volumes, Aiden, for the word Israel. It appears nowhere in 7 volumes, even though I, as counsel to the Iranian Canadian community, which was an intervener in this proceeding, we urged the commission to look at credible allegations reported on by the New York Times and Haaretz during the inquiry that Israel was conducting a covert campaign in Canada to generate Islamophobia as a way of justifying what it was doing to the Palestinian people and distracting people from its crimes. So none other than the New York Times reported on this. She didn't look at any of this. Neither did her staff. There's no indication they paid any attention to it. So if you're going to decry the presence of disinformation in our society and the threat that it poses to public discourse, well, why don't you actually focus on the real disinformation that
Now, Justice Hogue has called for Canada to, quote, develop a legislative framework to authorize collecting and assessing open source domestic intelligence and to create an organization to, quote, monitor the domestic open source online information environment for misinformation and disinformation that could impact Canadian democratic processes. But it has to be emphasized here. Hogue wants the organization to be able to give and receive intelligence and information, and says the government should consider this, allowing this organization the authority to interact with social media platforms. What are your thoughts on this proposal by Justice Hogue?
well, the first half of it, I think this is already happening. I think we would be naive in the extreme not to understand that Canada's so-called intelligence agencies are already monitoring the social media activities, the public commentary of people with whose politics they disagree. And just to give you a blatant example of this, peace activist Tamara Lawrence, who is a passionate and persuasive critic of NATO and Canadian government foreign policy, recently visited the Russian Federation to attend a women's conference. And when she returned, I interviewed her on my program, Reason to Resist, about this. When she returned from the Russian Federation, she was interrogated by a CSIS agent at Pearson Airport who told her that he's been following her work for years, and they're not supposed to be engaged in domestic spying, and was aware of their criticisms of NATO and so forth. So this is already happening. Like, who are we kidding? And the second half of it, though, I think that what she's doing, and it's amazing, Aiden, when people talk about disinformation and misinformation and so forth, they never use the word censorship. They always say things like content moderation and monitoring, because no one wants censorship. Our society, most people in our society are adamantly opposed to silencing of, critics of the government and of the corporatocracy. But that's what she's talking about here. I don't think there's any other way to read her report. She's encouraging the government not only to do what it's already doing, which is to monitor people whose politics they don't like, but also to censor by applying pressure upon social media companies. There was legislation adopted precisely for that purpose. I believe it was C-39, a draconian law that I've written about, which was designed to impose enormous pressure on social media companies to deplatform and silence people whom the government doesn't like. Fortunately, the legislation didn't pass because Trudeau prorogued Parliament before it could be approved by Parliament. But it seems to me that what she's doing is basically urging the government to adopt legislation of that nature and engage in censorship. She just doesn't call it that.
Now, you speaking about censorship, in the final report summary document, Hogue noted with concern that even if foreign stations like RT aren't authorized by CRTC, that's the Canada Radio Television Communications Organization, they can remain available online. Hogue stated that, quote, this is a problem to be considered, as discussed. Regulating the internet is not an easy task. Do you think this is another early warning shot that further censorship is coming on the Canadian internet?
Absolutely. What else? What else could she possibly be talking about? And let me just say something about RT. I appear regularly on RT, and I have never been asked to say anything. I have never been told not to say anything. I have never been subjected to any kind of pre-screening. This is a practice that is very common amongst Western media organizations, television networks. Before they have you on their program, if they're concerned that you might say something they don't like, they will interview you off air, ask you the questions they intend to ask you on air. And if they don't like the answers they hear off air, then the invitation is withdrawn. I've discussed this with numerous American commentators who appear on RT, people like the CIA whistleblower, John Kiriakou, Ray McGovern, Larry Johnson, all former members of the intelligence community of the United States. All of them appear regularly in RT. They told me exactly the same thing. They get pre-screened when they're invited to speak on major US television networks, which isn't too often nowadays. But when they appear on RT, there's absolutely no attempt made to control what they say or to screen what they're going to say. RT's coverage of US foreign policy, of Western foreign policy, is more honest by a country mile than any coverage you are going to see of Western foreign policy in a major media organization based in the West. Now, does RT have a pro-Russian perspective? Sure, it does. But you're going to tell me that, the Canadian and American television networks don't have a pro-Western perspective? Again, these people have been lying flagrantly to us for 15 months about a genocide in Gaza. They lied to us about Ukraine winning the war. They lied to us about the Afghan war. They lied to us about the Iraq war. So why are you picking on, a state media organization of a geopolitical rival of the West without addressing the shameless propaganda that is spewed by Western corporate media outlets every day? This judge, I say with the greatest of respect, is revealing that she has a political bias. She has a strong political bias for Western disinformation, while at the same time exhibiting antipathy towards what she regards as non-Western disinformation. If you're going to take on disinformation, then take it all on and do it in a way that respects the right of free speech of all Canadians. But don't pretend that, our media organizations are purer than the driven snow and all they do is impart important information to keep the citizenry informed. This is utter nonsense.
Right. And speaking about the front of media and disinformation, Hogue has called for the government to consider funding language training for new Canadians specifically aimed at promoting their access to professional media. That's a quote there. Could this be a bid to have Canada's government ramp up its propagandization of new immigrants to Canada? What are your thoughts here?
That's entirely possible. It's hard to say exactly what she had in mind. And one of the things one of my concerns, Aiden, is that some of these recommendations, like the one you just cited, are so ambiguously couched that the government may put on these recommendations an interpretation that is particularly hostile to free speech. That is certainly the ideological orientation of the Trudeau government. And I think it's likely to be the ideological orientation of the Conservative government, perhaps to an even greater degree. Can you imagine this government, the Poilievre government, having tolerance for vigorous and effective criticism of Israel or of Israel's wars in West Asia or, NATO or of Canada's relationship to the United States? I don't think Poilievre is going to have any tolerance for that. And he's going to take these recommendations, which are open doors to censorship, and he's going to drive a Mack truck through them, particularly the ones that are, ambiguously worded. So I think we should be very concerned about the indoctrination of, new Canadians, immigrants to the country, and other forms of brainwashing that seem to be becoming more and more common and accepted in the West nowadays.
And speaking about this potential of repression, what do you think the ramifications are of the RCMP, that is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, claiming that prosecutions are no longer necessarily the quote-unquote gold standard of foreign interference threat mitigation? And what does this say about the future of right to due process and assumption of innocence before guilt in the future for Canadians?
Well, I'm not sure what to make of that comment by the RCMP. I think what they might be saying is that the standards of evidence and the onus of proof in litigation, criminal prosecutions in particular, are too weighty for the government to meet in many of these cases. So, for example, as Justice Hogue pointed out, these intelligence reports, which have caused so much of the hysteria around alleged foreign interference, usually are, I mean, they're not sworn testimony. The people, the sources of information are not identified. They're not available to be cross-examined in court. A lot of it is just innuendo, insinuation, dubious interpretations of an imperfect body of evidence. That kind of information is not likely to get you convictions in a court of law, and rightly so. So I think what the RCP is saying is we can't rely upon the criminal justice system to silence people we don't like, so we're going to have to resort to other methods.
And that's actually a
Uh,
good shout. That's a good shout. Because very specifically afterwards, they talk about other disruptions, community policing, which baffled me as a phrase. And yes, most certainly, yes, you were right on the right track. That's what they talk about in the report.
yeah. So let's talk about community policing. What do they mean by that? If you are uh, expressing views publicly that the RCMP doesn't like, and some, RCMP officer shows up at your door, and this has happened. This happened, for example, to a law clerk in Ontario who filmed the interaction. She had two RCMP officials show up at her door, come into her office, and begin to question her about things she had said online about Israel and the Palestinian struggle for freedom. And she broke down in tears and was enormously intimidated, and rightly so. So they'll show up at your door, right? And they're dressed in suits. They're not bearing firearms. And they'll be very polite and very kind. And they'll say, oh, we're just here as part of our community policing initiative. But really, what they're doing is they're scaring the bejesus out of people. They're intimidating people. I think that's probably what they mean by so-called community policing. It's using the power of the state without resorting to prosecutions because they can't secure a conviction, using the power of the state to intimidate people into silence.
And on the track of the RCMP, actually, I want to mention now, before we go on, that person Dimitri mentioned is Joanna Barry.
Correct.
Certainly, she's still figuring out what to do uh, on this whole process, but most certainly, my impression is that she's not done fighting back there. CSIS has also targeted people before. I think you would know very well, Dimitri, the fact that they went to Ken Stone, the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War treasurer, his house back in the mid 2010s. Again, he had to go file complaints, went through the process, and it was admitted that they didn't follow due process and that there wasn't a real benefit to it. But again,
Yeah.
they'll brazenly do that. But I think what's different is that they would do this to, racialized communities, to minorities before, but I think now it's everybody. Now it's everybody. The
Yes.
gloves are well and truly off here. And speaking of the RCMP, there's another recommendation, okay? 38. It states the RCMP should prioritize recruitment, training, and retention of staff, skill sets required to investigate and disrupt foreign interference activities. So again, you talked about this, right? In terms of the question of not being able to secure prosecutions, them doing these disruptions, this quote unquote community policing. They talk about rejecting people around immigration too and other methods of these disruptions. What do you think about this? If this priority was implemented, what do you think the ramifications would be for the RCMP's role?
They'll go hog wild. I mean, these people have a lot of the power of the RCMP is enormous. They can spy on people, they can gather information on people, they can intimidate people, they can intimidate social media companies. So again, it's important to understand that the RCMP, this is also true of CSIS, and it's true of the municipal and provincial police forces as well. These are not apolitical organizations. They have a political perspective, which inevitably informs how they engage in policing, in law enforcement. They are overwhelmingly in support of the project of Western hegemony. They believe, the people at the leadership level of these organizations, that Western governments have an innate right to rule globally and to use the considerable economic and military power at their disposal to impose their will on the rest of the world. They believe in higher military spending. They believe in an expansion of police powers. They are hostile to left-wing movements, to anti-imperialist movements, to peace movements, and they will their political disposition will inevitably influence how they conduct their law enforcement activities. So if you empower them to quote unquote disrupt, what they regard as disinformation, what invariably they're going to do is they're going to focus their efforts on people who support the oppressed, on people who are anti-imperialist in their orientation, on people who are champions of social justice. They are the ones who are going to be quote unquote disrupted. And they will use techniques like intimidation. They will pressure social media companies to deplatform or censor opinions that they don't like. That's the world in which we're heading. And this is why I said at the outset, I have mixed feelings about this report, the final report of the Commission into Alleged Foreign Interference of the Commission of Inquiry, because on the one hand, it took a hard look at the evidence of interference in Canada's last two elections and found virtually nothing. But on the other hand, the judge, sadly, is embracing this scaremongering around disinformation without identifying the major sources of disinformation in our society. And that's very, very troubling. So I hope that, the government doesn't respond to this by giving law enforcement authorities even more power to suppress opinions that they don't like.
So, Dimitri, now I do want to talk about the law further, because in the report it mentioned with the Countering Foreign Interference Act, it amended the Security of Information Act. I think you've written about the Bill C-70 before, no doubt. I want to read this out. It's important because the offense that it's punishable by maximum penalty of life in prison and maximum penalties for preparatory acts, 5 years now. It's 5 years now. So let me read this out, okay? Deceptive or surreptitious conduct for a foreign entity. A new general foreign interference offense where a person knowingly engages in surreptitious or deceptive conduct or admits surreptitiously or with intent to deceive, to do anything at the direction of, for the benefit of, or in association with a foreign entity. This offense applies if the person's conduct is for a purpose prejudicial to the safety or interests of the Canadian government, or if the person is reckless as to whether their conduct is likely to harm Canadian interests. For the audience, I will include an image of this in full so people can read it and pause their screen for a second. But Dimitri, this new law and this life punishment, I mean, this is incredibly dangerous, no?
It is the most severe penalty that the Canadian government can impose. We don't, life imprisonment is as harsh as it gets in Canada's criminal justice system. These terms that this legislation employs are very vague. I'm particularly concerned about the notion of Canadian interests. Who defines Canadian interests? It is believed widely by the Canadian establishment. It is really an article of faith, for example, that it is in Canadian interest that Canada be a member of NATO. My view, and that of a significant proportion of the population, is that it is actually profoundly contrary to the interests of Canada that it be in NATO, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that NATO has engaged in wars of aggression. NATO is constantly hounding its member states to spend more money on the military. We're now hearing, this 2% threshold, which is wildly excessive and arbitrary, 2% of GDP. We're now hearing that that's not enough. Donald Trump is talking about trying to get to close to 5%. It inevitably is going to result in massive amounts of public funding being taken away from things like our healthcare system, our education system, our civilian infrastructure, to military spending, much of which is going to end up getting shipped off to American military contractors in the United States. So I could go on and on. These are just some of the reasons why I think Canada's membership in NATO is profoundly contrary to the interests of the country. Now, if the entire political establishment and law enforcement disagree with me, which they do, they think, as you know, NATO is absolutely essential to Canada's national security. Then how are they going to, view people like myself who are out there calling for us to withdraw from NATO and for NATO to be disbanded? They're gonna think we're taking a position that's contrary to Canadian interests, and because it happens to align with the view of other countries, geopolitical rivals. The Russians don't like NATO for obvious reasons. China doesn't like NATO for obvious reasons. They're going to say, well, you're taking a position that's contrary to Canadian interests, and you're promoting, Russian propaganda or Chinese propaganda, when in fact it is a point of view that is grounded in evidence, in logic, and that I've arrived at independently, free of any influence of any foreign government. That's the kind of dangerous, suppression of criticism that this legislation is likely to engender. And, Aiden, because the penalty is so severe, life imprisonment, if you think there's even just a 5% chance of you being prosecuted for something, for expressing some point of view that these people think is contrary to Canada's national interests, the vast majority of people will silence themselves. They will self-censor. Even if there's a small risk of prosecution, when the penalty is so severe, you're inevitably going to chill free speech. And I believe exactly what this legislation is designed to do.
Now, things get even darker here. So, in this Countering Foreign Interference Act, one of the most crazy rules that caught my eye when I was reviewing the volumes of the Foreign Interference Report is that for the federal court judges, they can now consider sensitive information in a judicial review proceeding without the person challenging the government action being able to see it. So the client will have to rely on a security clear lawyer being appointed to represent their interests and to access this sensitive information. They can't see this. So how can a client know if their lawyer is acting in good faith slash not even, straight up collaborating with the government? And what would their options even be if they're a victim in this sort of way? How are they to respond here, right? We're in an insane veil of secrecy.
Yeah, this is a frontal assault on due process. You can't properly instruct your lawyer if your lawyer cannot share with you key quote unquote evidence that is being proffered against you. This is absurd. And the other thing is, Aiden, I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for over 30 years. Although I've scrupulously respected Canadian law, I have serious doubts that I could ever get security clearance. Because the government, because these people who grant security clearance are going to look at my commentary about NATO. They're going to look about, my commentary about the Ukraine war, about the fact that I have repeatedly stated that we should be trying to foster good relations with China and Russia. And they're going to think that I'm a threat. I'm a security threat. So they won't give me the security clearance. So they're going to be the only lawyers out there who are going to get security clearance are going to be people who think like they do, like the law enforcement officials do, and CSIS and RCMP. If you don't think like they do, you're not going to get security clearance and you're not going to be able to view the evidence. But even if you can view the evidence, as I say, you can't properly advise your client when you can't share with your client what you've seen. It's absurd. And this is all happening in a context where even Justice Hogue has acknowledged the severe limitations of intelligence and how it has the potential to be not only terribly wrong, but to harm the interests of individuals who are, wrongly accused by the intelligence agencies of undermining the national interest.
I want to just bring up one quick example. It was mentioned by Hogue in the report where the NSCIOP report, they had mistakenly thought that the one MP had given classified information to an Indian diplomat. But then they learned later that actually the intelligence was wrong and they information was already released to the general public. Now imagine if imagine this report was more public, if the names of these supposed traitors had have been put publicly, they would have been destroyed, right? So imagine how dangerous it is to weaken what they're doing, this full frontal assault on standards of, what can be evidence, what can be used in court. There's a reason for that, and it's being attacked viciously and wildly by the state. Now, Dimitri, I do want to say, as a Green Party leadership candidate in 2020.
So the incident you cite, where there was a false allegation that somebody passed classified information. Of course, the number one harm that may result to that wrongly accused person is reputational. But in the current environment in which we're operating, you could be putting somebody's physical safety at risk. Because there are people out there, we have a significant number of firearms circulating in our society, and there are people out there who are capable of taking, matters into their own hands and targeting some candidate who they wrongly believe to be a traitor with violence. So this is extremely dangerous. These leaks of totally unsubstantiated allegations of, treason and, collaboration with hostile foreign governments and so forth. And it just underlines the importance of, controlling, exercising very vigorous control over the activities of our intelligence agencies and our law enforcement agencies when it comes to allegations of this nature. Unfortunately, as I said, the report seems to want to see an expansion of their powers. Their powers to, survey the population and control what people can and cannot say should be highly restricted, not expanded.
All right, Dimitri. So, as a former Green Party leadership candidate in 2020 who nearly won, internal democracy is something I'm sure is very important to you. Now, Justice Hogue said there is the chief electoral officer for Elections Canada had wanted to see this, and Hogue endorsed this recommendation. For Section 282.4 of the Canada Elections Act, again, people, I will put this up for you in the video, prohibiting undue influence by foreigners should be amended to apply to nomination and leadership contests, should also apply at all times. This is because attempts to influence may happen at any time. Nomination and leadership contests do not necessarily occur during an election or pre-election period. So there's two sections that I showed you in advance, right? Section 282.4 1A and C and 282.4 2A. So how does Hogue's proposed changes with those small little clauses in context, how could they damage the future of internal democracy in Canada?
Well, this is the section is actually quite limited in scope as currently drafted. So what the phrase undue influence is defined by this legislation essentially to mean knowingly incurring any expense to directly promote or oppose a candidate in an election. So it goes on to say that this section does not apply if the only thing done by the person or entity to influence the elector to vote or refrain from voting for a particular candidate or party consists of A, an expression of their opinion about the outcome or desired outcome of the election, B, a statement by them that encourages the elector to vote or refrain from voting for any candidate or registered party, C, the transmission to the public through broadcasting or through electronic or print media of an editorial, a debate, a speech, an interview, a column, a letter, a commentary, or news, regardless of the expense incurred in doing so. If no contravention of subsection 331 or 2 is involved in the transmission. So basically, this legislation really only applies to covert expenses being incurred directly for the purpose of influencing the voting public. And I don't think expanding this to nomination contests and so forth is really going to amount to a hill of beans. Um, what I find very interesting about this section, in fact, is that, as it's drafted, if, for example, some think tank, which is funded by the US government, like, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, puts some, op-ed in a newspaper, manages to persuade the National Post or the Globe and Mail to publish an op-ed in the newspaper, which is, trashing some particular candidate or political party, that's okay under this legislation. There's no problem with that. Even though they're indirectly funded by, arms of the US government and huge corporations like Koch Industries and so forth, that's okay. I mean, why is that okay? Why is it okay for, and this is something that we raised in the course of this inquiry with the judge. We said that there are think tanks in Canada that are being funded covertly by arms of the US government, by military contractors, other huge US corporations that are having a massive influence on the public discourse. That's serious interference, foreign interference in Canadian politics. And by the way, I don't favor those think tanks being silenced. What I suggested and what my client suggested is that they be obliged to disclose all sources of funding, so people would know where their money's coming from. Because I oppose censorship, including of people with whom I disagree. But at a bare minimum, people should know where their funding is coming from. And this legislation doesn't require them to do that, and nor did the final report of the Commission of Inquiry into Foreign Interference make any such recommendation.
Thank you for that alternate perspective, Dimitri. It's good to have that from you as a lawyer. Now, you mentioned your work in terms of the foreign interference inquiry, and that's a great lead into my final question. So you took on the role, lead counsel for the Iranian Canadian Congress's participation in the foreign interference inquiry. Can you explain why you agreed to take on this role, and can you talk more about your experience representing them during the inquiry?
I took on the role, by the way, on a pro bono basis. I wasn't compensated. I didn't ask to be compensated. I took it on because I feel very strongly about this issue. And I know that the Iranian Canadian Congress, shares many of my views about these things. We were completely in agreement, as we expressed in our submissions, our written submissions to the commission, that U.S. government interference in Canadian politics is a serious problem, and that the commission should look at it. The same with respect to Israel, that Israeli government interference in Canadian politics was a serious problem. We agreed that censorship is not the appropriate method to deal with political perspectives that the government doesn't like. We agreed that the allegations of foreign interference by China, Russia, and Iran were not supported by a meaningful body of credible evidence. And so, because we shared these views, something that I feel very strongly about, I was happy to represent them on a pro bono basis. And I'll tell you, Aidan, the experience was quite an eye-opener for me, because it became very clear to me from the outset that we were dealing with people who have a very strong political bias, in the whole question of whether or not countries like China, Russia, Iran are interfering in Canadian politics. They are ideologically inclined to believe these allegations, and they are ideologically inclined not to take seriously allegations that our supposed allies, like the United States and Israel, are interfering in our elections. That's their ideological orientation, and I think that this is reflected in the report.
All right. Well, Dimitri, thank you very much for your time to discuss this final report of the Canadian Foreign Interference Inquiry. So if Canada Files viewers aren't aware of your work already, which I'd be shocked, frankly, where should they follow you?
Most of my work appears on YouTube on Reason to Resist. That's the name of our program. And I'm also on X and Instagram. My handle on those two platforms is @Dimitri Lascaris.
All right. Well, Canophiles viewers, thank you for making it to the end of this episode. If you appreciate the journalism that's being done by this outlet, please consider setting up a monthly, annual, or one-time donation. If that's not affordable for you, you're struggling, please just share the work, spread it around, help us reach more people. Goodbye, everyone. We'll see you for the next interview.